Welcome to the Parenting Reset, Raising Healthy Minds and Hearts. I'm your host, Rita Lalman, and today's conversation is one every parent needs to hear. Parenting in today's world is hard. We love our children deeply, but so many of us are exhausted, overwhelmed, and quietly wondering if we're doing enough. The good news is you don't have to be a perfect parent. You just have to be a connected one.
Thank you for being here. My name is Rita Lalman, and this is our Parenting Reset, Raising Healthy Minds and Hearts. Whether you're joining here because a friend invited you, or because this title spoke to you, or because you're just tired and curious, you are welcome here. We have parents from our church community. We have parents joining us from different parts of the world. Parenting has been one of the most challenging tasks I have ever had in my life. And every time I think it's getting better, I learn that there's so much more I have to grow and know. And therefore, we have this parenting reset today. We have two extraordinary women joining us. First, Karen Louie. Karen is a seasoned teacher, counselor, author, family life mentor. She has over 35 years of ministry experience across UK, Singapore, and Southeast Asia. She and her husband, John, are the creators of Good Enough Parenting, a program designed to help parents build stronger, healthier families. Karen holds a master's in counseling. She's a master solution-focused practitioner, and she uses Clifton strengths to encourage and equip others. She's now based in Texas, where she mentors families, travels with her husband, and spends time with her children and grandchildren. Karen, we're so glad you're with us.
Thank you, Rita and Pam. Thank you so much for having me.
And next, Dr. Pam George. Pam is an educator, professor, author, consultant. She's passionate about helping families and educators support children through emotional connection, brain-based strategies, and faith-centered relationships. Her expertise spans special education, emotional regulation, and trauma-informed practice. She equips parents with practical tools to help children thrive emotionally, socially, and spiritually. She is an author of Sparkle, Your 7-Step Guide to a Joy-Infused Life. Pam, thank you for being here with us. Thanks, Rita. We're going to have a conversation today, guys. It's not a lecture, it's a conversation, and you're invited. As parents, it can be the most challenging and the most rewarding job we have ever had in our lives. And so we can get all the help we can. I really believe, and I personally am looking forward to learning from these two women. You will have some insight, something that you can use in your journey of parenting. So thank you for joining us. Karen, I want to start with you first. It's something a lot of parents are sitting with right now. Parents today are tired. They're carrying so much. And we feel overwhelmed and unsure if we are doing enough. And from your perspective, what is the biggest challenge parents face in raising emotionally healthy children today?
Of course, there are a myriad of challenges, but the biggest one that's, I believe, blocking parents, whether it's parents of adult children or parents of toddlers or anything in between, certainly with teens, the challenge is to say no to so many distractions that prevent us from having the kind of connection we need to have with our kids and spending that kind of time. That would be my short answer.
Wow. Yeah, I guess that's an honest place to start, Karen. It is true. We have so many things that are coming at us in the current time. But I do believe, for me, I feel like, okay, all right, I'm in this with everybody else. The concept of good enough parenting, I know you and John have started and you run this program, is incredibly freeing for so many parents, even just the idea of it. Could you explain what it actually means and why perfection is not the goal in parenting?
Excellent. When we were living in Singapore, we were actually helping to lead a church in Singapore. Our church had reached a large enough size that we wanted to have a hands-on program for the members of the church to help people in the community, not just to donate money to charity, but to be able to do something hands-on. And we started praying what direction God would want us to go. And at that exact same time, there was an article in the Singapore newspaper talking about 12-year-olds committing suicide in droves after the exam. I think it was so bad they became desperate and put that on the front page. So that was a shock. Our daughter had just started first grade. So I think several things made us think parenting is something we need to look into as a way to help people, because parents here seemed very stressed out. A master's in counseling, Dr. Winnicott in the UK, who had come up with that phrase when he was helping mothers. He would say to mothers, you don't have to be perfect, you just have to be good enough. So we realized part of the strain of parenting in Singapore, which is where we ended up coming up with the idea for good enough parenting in the first place. The strain was about my kids have to be perfect at school. They have to be perfect in behavior. I have to be a perfect parent. All of that kind of thinking leads to disaster and stress. That's not just in Singapore. I think it's quite pervasive in Asia. And I think it became a fad in other places too, which probably led to that whole concept of helicopter parenting, where you're on top of them all the time. One time I was teaching this, I will not say which Asian country it was in, but I was visiting a different Asian country and I was addressing moms of a particular school. It wasn't just people from church. I was talking about these things and core needs, and I did mention the need to play with your children, if possible, every day outside. Give them some time to play outside. So afterwards, a mom that I had not met before approached me and said, can I get your advice about this playing outside? I said, yeah, sure. She said, I'm so exhausted from taking my kids to after-school programs that by the time we get home, I don't have the energy to go to the park or to the playground. Is it okay if I let my paid domestic helper take them to the playground? I said, if you have to, of course, that's okay, but it's not ideal because it's about you spending time with them as well as them getting to play outside. Perhaps you can cut down one of those activities. Just do 1 or 2 activities a week after school. And on the other days, make sure you're playing outside with your kids. Before I finished that thought, I said, oh, and by the way, how old is your child? And she said, oh, he's 4. And I said, 4? And I said, okay, I'm going to change my answer. Bag all the other classes and just go outside every day. I said, your child needs time with you and time in the park more than they need extra math and reading when they're 4 years.
That sounds so familiar. Hearing what parents struggle with, I'm not good enough and I have to do this and I have to do that. I'm tempted to think like that, even though my kids are older now. My youngest is 18, but I still feel like I'm not doing enough. So that thought is comforting, and knowing what fits who and what stage of life. Thank you, Karen, for that. From your work in brain science and child development, I'd love your perspective. Nowadays, we hear a lot about kids going through anxiety, even young kids, teens, and young adults, emotional dysregulation, disconnection among children. What do you believe is happening in children's emotional and brain development that parents should understand better?
Thanks, Rita, for asking. I agree with what Karen was talking about. Just those first formative years, if you're a parent of a young child. I'm in the stage of life where I'm a grandma now, and I got the blessing of having my grandchild live with me. They just moved in maybe a couple of months, and I enjoy getting up and seeing my grandchild, and it brings me so much joy. I think one of the biggest things parents need to understand is that many of our children's brains are shaped by constant overstimulation. I think we can also be stimulated. And I want to say this gently because we're all exhausted. Karen talking about the 4-year-old who had so many activities to go to, and the mom saying she's exhausted. Today, if we feel like we can't handle something, what do? We might go to the screen. We might put our child in front of the screen because we're just trying to survive. We want them to be quiet in church. So what do? We put a screen in front of them. We want them to calm a meltdown. What do? We put a screen in front of them. And what happens is screens impact the developing brain. And one of the biggest concerns is that they overstimulate the reward system. So let me just explain it in terms we can understand. When we were kids, you and I, Rita, we didn't have screens and we learned to tolerate boredom. And right now, kids cannot tolerate boredom. So that boredom tolerance decreases. I train educators. What we find is kids in school who cannot focus. So focus weekends. And then real life activities like maybe sitting through a dinner. When we were raising kids, 5 p.m., all of us sat at the table. There were no screens. We talked. We enjoyed dinner. But today, what happens, that child might feel like, this is too slow. Can I just get out of here? Real life activities begin to feel really slow, and emotional regulation becomes harder. So those are all some of the traps of why there's an increase in anxiety, emotional dysregulation, and disconnection because of the power of screens and using screens to regulate and to calm people down rather than the old way.
Thank you, Ben. That gives a lot to think about. I recognize the term digital dementia. That's a new term I've been looking into, where a lot of us spend time looking at the screen and scrolling, and many parts of our brain is not actually being used. And it is equivalent to having dementia one day. And that's a scary thought. So maybe we should research that, because I came across that last week and I thought that's interesting. Karen, let me come back to you, because our children are living with these unmet needs. And I know your work talks a lot about core emotional needs. You actually mentioned it earlier. What are some of the most important emotional needs parents should focus on meeting?
I love talking about this. So way back when we started wanting to help parents in the congregation and in the C region, one of the things that parents asked for was, please give us teaching on how to be better parents. And our children were little, so we didn't know ourselves. So we were like, all right, we're learning. We're only a few years ahead of you. We'll try our best. So we started looking into so many things. And then because of wanting to help the community, we started getting into learning about parenting more. If you could strip parenting down to the most absolute important properties, what would you want it to be based on the Bible and based on what we knew was working for us at that time? We came up with 4 points. And then later, like a year or two later, as we learned about schema therapy, when John was becoming a schema therapist, we realized that the domains of the 18 negative schemas correlated exactly with those things that biblically we were presenting already to our parents. We were like, wow, that's amazing. For instance, the first domain of the negative schemas is called disconnection and rejection. And our name that correlated was affection and nurturance. But as John got more in touch with how schemas are formed, there was research at the same time on, is there such a thing as core emotional needs? And so as that research was coming out, what kind of showed were the 4 core emotional needs are basically the opposite of the domains of the negative schemas. So if you look at Jeffrey Young's research on the schemas that develop when your needs are not met growing up, and he came up with 18, and they're in 4 different domains. When you meet the 4 core emotional needs, you are preventing the strengthening of the negative schemas. And later, John did his PhD on positive schemas. As you meet the 4 core emotional needs, you're not only preventing negative schemas from developing or from strengthening, you're also causing positive schemas to be developed. Now, I will quickly tell you what are those 4 core emotional needs. They are connection and acceptance, healthy autonomy and performance, reasonable limits, and realistic standards and reciprocity. So connection and acceptance is about, no matter what's happening, your goal is that your children will feel underneath everything else connected to you and accepted by you. That doesn't mean you're not going to get upset with them. That doesn't mean They're not going to get mad at you. It just means that overall, they will carry in their hearts that deep feeling that my parents and I are connected and that they accept me no matter what. That doesn't mean they approve of everything I do, but they accept me. That connection and acceptance. And I always say, if you don't meet that one, you can't even meet the other ones anyway. That's the first one. The next one, healthy autonomy and performance. In general, this is a super generalized statement here, but in general, in the West, parents tend to give a little bit too much autonomy too soon. In the East, very generalized, parents often don't give enough autonomy. And so it's got to be the healthy autonomy, age appropriate and at the right time, continually letting them become their own person, separate from the parent. Reasonable limits is about boundaries and being able to say no, helping them to learn that there are consequences for behavior in life. Lastly, realistic standards and reciprocity is about helping children not feel that they have to be the best. You want them to have goals and strive for things and use their gifts, but not so that they feel that they always have to be the top in the class or the best at this or go professional in my sport or be a concert pianist or whatever. When John and I were doing this, we did stick in our own core need too, which we called the +1 because it wasn't from the schema therapy research. And that was spiritual values and community, because spiritual values are going to be the foundation in your whole family.
Pan, I want to come to you with something that I think could be a real help for the parents as well, because so often we say a child is angry or shut down or refusing to listen, right? When a child is angry, defiant, shut down, parents often assume that it's a behavior problem. How can understanding brain states help parents respond differently to these moments? Do you have some sort of a mental model that parents can use in moments like this?
Thank you for that question. And I want to relate to what Karen talked about, those 4 needs, because it's so important to understand what the kid needs and what you need. We all need connection and acceptance, healthy autonomy and reasonable limits, and be able to have realistic expectations. So when a kid is angry or shouting, we can get triggered. I became a mom when I was 26. I had no idea what to do. And the strategies that were taught to me were, okay, we have to teach the kid to obey. They just need to obey. I didn't understand the core need of connection. I was into controlling the behavior. Now, I understand as an adult, the only behavior, and I teach this to teachers, the only behavior you can control, the only person you can control is who? You cannot control anybody else. So one of the skills that's really helped is teaching parents and teaching myself to listen to emotion rather than the behavior. All behavior is a form of communication. So if a kid is yelling or screaming or throwing a tantrum in the store or at church, giving him a screen to quiet down, we can train ourselves to understand what is the emotion underneath that. Because children often don't have the emotional vocabulary to say, I'm feeling overwhelmed, or I'm embarrassed, or I feel disconnected from you right now, or I'm anxious. I don't know how to handle this feeling. They don't have the words. So one of the most powerful shifts that parents can make is to learn to listen beneath the behavior. And you asked me about brain states. And our brain, if we can just dumb it down to 3 different states, we've got the survival part of our brain where we need to feel attached. And that's what Karen was talking about, that connection. We have the middle limbic part of our brain where we experience a lot of emotions. And then we have the prefrontal cortex where that's the rational part of the brain. One of the 3 things that educators are taught is asking the students, what do you need based on those brain states? So if they are in that survival, asking them, do you need a hug? Do you need to be heard? Or do you need help? The 3 H's is like a framework that you can remember For example, one of our friends' kids come in to our house for dinner for Thanksgiving. Karen, can I share a story, Rita?
Sure, go ahead.
So I had a friend of mine's kid come over and she was 5 years old. She was playing a game with my husband and she lost. And she just threw a tantrum and she's just shouting. The parents immediately wanted to discipline her because that was not acceptable behavior when you go out to someone's house. And I remember pulling the kid out and asking her, what do you need? Do you need a hug? And I knew she probably needed a hug. So I said, do you need a hug? And she was only 5. She said, yes. And I held her and hugged her and her whole nervous system calmed down. And then she was fine and she went back to play. So if I can just give parents that one tool is train your brain. Your brain can focus on only one thing at a time. And we usually focus on the behavior and controlling it. Oh, I've got to make sure I look good and my kid needs to obey me in this public space or at church or I'm going to be judged or people are going to think I'm not a good mom. If you can remove all of that from our brain and learn to listen to the emotion underneath and what does this kid need and connect it with the brain states of does he need a hug? Does he need to be heard? Does he need to be helped? Maybe they're frustrated doing homework and they need some help. Hopefully that'll help.
I like that tool, what you shared about. Because I think I can relate to that feeling of when my kids are older and still when they are not doing what they're supposed to do or they're not doing something that I would think is the right thing to do, I automatically think that it has something to do with me and I'm judging their behavior. I guess this tool applies to all ages, right? All kids. We have to ask ourselves, what do you need? Thank you, Pam. And I appreciate that framework that you have given us. And now coming back to you, Karen, I know as parents, we wrestle with this constantly, right? We want to be loving. And yet at the same time, we want to have boundaries. And what I found myself in a pendulum, sometimes I'm swinging on the other side. I'm like so loving. And then I'm so mad because either I'm too controlling or I'm too relaxed and I let them do whatever they want. And I wanted people to figure out, well, how do we, I know you mentioned earlier while you were speaking, how do we balance love and boundaries? How can parents create healthy limits while still maintaining that emotional connection, even in our talk?
Okay, so here's what I tell parents. Loving your kid, your child, means meeting all the core emotional needs. And we liken the core emotional needs to a plant. If you have a plant, it needs water, it needs air, it needs nutrients, and it needs sunlight. It's got 4 needs, and every plant needs all 4. If you give it water and nutrients and then stick it in the closet, it's still going to die. You've got to meet all 4 core emotional needs. If you love your child, you will meet all the needs. And one of those needs is reasonable limits. So yes, connection is vital. Without that, they probably won't listen to your giving them limits. So yes, you have to have connection. But what you tell yourself is, because I love my child, I will meet their need of reasonable limits because I know that's the loving thing to do. That's what I tell myself.
Thank you. I think that's a good thought. That's practical for us to know that I have something to do. I must learn how to meet those core needs. And so if I can do that, then I can take care of the other things. But your example of the plant is the best because I love plants and I'm very protective of my plant.
And we understand that principle. What's funny is I remember one of my kids was going through puberty time where their emotions were all over the place. And there was one day in particular where my child was screaming and throwing a tantrum and angry. I hate this family, blah, blah, blah. At that moment, I was making them stay in their room. It lasted about 3 hours. During that time, I went in the room, patted them on the leg, and they were like knocking my hand off of their leg because they didn't want me to touch them. And I said, I just want you to know there's nothing you can do that will make me stop loving you. There's also nothing you can do that will make me change the consequence I've given you today. In their heart, they know it's right. That's the funny thing. And sometimes people say, thank me later. I remember for our son, he, like many boys, would always struggle with being addicted to video games and things like that. Somehow the boys gravitate more to those video games, although I'm sure there's often girls doing it too. He was born in 1994. In those days, they had PlayStation and various things, and we had rules about how much time he was allowed to be on those. So fast forward, when he went to university, and I visited him at his university for the first time, and he had a roommate, he said, Mom, thank you for not letting me play video games all the time. He said, I realized my roommate is flunking school because they're addicted to video games. And he said, I'm so grateful that you didn't let me do that. But of course, at the time, it was like, my friends get to do it. Why are you so strict? Fast forward, and he really understood that.
Don't we all wish that we can wait for the day when our children will say, thank you for being so hardline with me?
Yeah.
Still waiting for the day.
Now he's a dad, and he has a 5-year-old boy who loves to play video games. And if you allowed him to, he would get on the iPad and watch YouTube videos and all those things that Pam was referring to earlier. And there was a time when they did allow him to watch some YouTube Pokemon shows on the big television. So that way he wasn't scrolling, but he was still watching a lot of those videos. And then they realized this isn't helping him. We'll save those for maybe on the weekend. But in general, we're not going to have them do that at all. And so I think after 1 month of that, the teacher in his kindergarten called them and said, what's going on with your son? And they were like, I don't know. What do you mean? They got nervous. And he was like, he concentrates better than any of the kids at school. Suddenly he's got the best concentration of anyone. And they said, oh, the only difference is he's not getting very much screen time right now. And they were like, oh, wow, keep up the good work.
That's awesome. Thank you, Karen. I do love that part when you said, I love you, but I'm not changing my mind about the consequence. That's the hardest part, keeping that balance where you're still able to love them and express, but not change your mind about the consequence, right? Keeping both at the same level. I love that part. Thank you, Karen. Pam, here's something I think every parent in this room needs. It's about self-regulation, right? And how do we help our children regulate unless we regulate ourselves first? We often react in the heat of the moment. I know I have, and that's been a big thing for me. What are some practical ways parents can regulate their own emotions before responding to their child, right? Whether it be an adult child, whether it be a teen or a young child. But we have to first take care of ourselves. How do you think we can do that? Any suggestions?
I just want to piggyback on what Karen was talking about, because I think that's so important with the connection versus the limits, the East and the West. I think the West, we tend to, like, I know for me, being raised in both, my parents were from India. And so there was a lot of overhelping. When you see a kid struggle, to jump in and help. If a kid cannot hold a spoon, let me just feed you. Versus in the West, maybe let the kid sit there and finish his food and they take forever. And I'm not going to let you leave this table till you finish your food. And so there's those both extremes. And I think one of the things that we have to really understand is something called the productive struggle that we talk about. What the productive struggle is, and we know that when we have limits, it makes us, we have to struggle through it. And as parents, we don't like to see our children struggle, and we want to quickly jump in and help. And so understanding this concept of productive struggle, and if they can't struggle, they're not going to grow. And so we have to let them struggle a little bit. And so while they're struggling, we have to regulate our emotions, because they're looking at our faces, because our brains have something called mirroring. And if we feel tense, they feel tense. If we feel anxious, they feel anxious because of mirror neurons in our brain. So it's so important for us to make sure that our demeanor, our face, we regulate it. I know when I was raising my kids, I have a serious face and I'm always thinking. And I remember driving in the car and I'm thinking, and my son from the back asking me, "Are you upset with me?" I wasn't even thinking about him, but our faces show they're trying to understand emotions. And if we are not happy and we're not excited, we can send the wrong message. So how do we regulate our emotions? We have to model it because kids learn from adults. I think many adults are struggling with the same things our children are struggling with. I notice my own tolerance for boredom, stillness, rest, focus has decreased in today's fast-paced world because we're constantly stimulated, always scrolling, multitasking, rushing, reacting. So when our child melts down, argues, or gets emotionally overwhelmed, our nervous system is already overloaded too. And so that's why it's so important to regulate our nervous system, because children actually borrow calm from regulated adults. So one of the things that I encourage parents to do is just pause, learning to just pause. What am I feeling right now? And sometimes we want this perfect parenting strategy, but it's just pause, breathe, and connect. Pause before reacting, taking that slow breath. And I love how the Holy Spirit is described as the breath of God. Taking that slow breath and asking yourself, what kind of parent do I want to be at this moment? Do I want to respond out of stress, shame, anger, instead of, because we respond the way we are feeling. So it's important to pause and notice what we're feeling. And I just want to add, Rita and I, we've created the 6-week coaching program to help reset our brain and nervous system, because I feel like I need that community. And I love those 6 weeks of learning to train my brain to reset my brain so I can be present, because I have a lot of balls I'm juggling. And it's easy for me to live out of reaction rather than learning to reset my brain every single day. I hope that helps.
Thank you. Thank you, Pam. I love those steps. The pause. I think we all need to pause now for 10 seconds. Pause feels so good, but where does my pause go when I need it? I know for me that has been a challenge because sometimes my mouth works faster than my brain. So I have to be like, pause now and breathe and now speak. So thank you. Karen, I want to ask you something that's tender, because so many of us parents are carrying things from our own childhood that we don't want to pass on. I know for me, this past decade has been a journey learning about where I come from and how that impacted me. My behavior right now is directly because of the way I was raised. But we don't know how to stop that cycle, right? As parents, we realize things about us and we wish it could be different. So how do we parents unintentionally pass down these harmful habits or patterns from our own upbringing? How can we recognize and break these unhealthy parenting patterns? What would you say?
I think it's a crucial question, because it gets back to that idea of perfection. No matter how loving you are as a parent, everybody has blind spots. And so it's likely that even the best of parents with the best of intentions will still be passing down some dysfunction. Most of us are not even in that category because of our own dysfunction growing up. One of the phrases that John and I stole from one of our early mentors was, dysfunction is the gift that keeps on giving, because it just keeps passing down unless you are very intentional about breaking the cycle. A lot of times we're brought up in our own family of origin not feeling like certain emotions were not accepted in the family. So, for example, my parents were extremely loving and encouraging and gave autonomy in a very healthy way and did so many things well. I got disciplined and had more boundaries than most of the people in my school. My parents were not perfectionistic, demanding I get straight A's or whatever. So I would say in many ways they met those core emotional needs. However, they didn't know how to talk about emotions. They didn't know how to process emotions. Particularly, I would say the three emotions that many families don't know how to talk about are anger, sadness, and fear. So when I was in elementary school, fourth or fifth grade or something like that, I won't go into all the details, but I developed a rat and mouse phobia. And it got so bad that if I just saw a mouse, if someone just said the word rat, I would have a panic attack. And you have to go in the other room and cry and breathe. One day we lived on a farm and we did have the occasional mouse or rat, and especially in the house, we would have mice sometimes. My dad saw me see a mouse and he saw what was happening on my face. And instead of giving me the hug, he wasn't mad. He just said, "Go to your room," because he wasn't equipped with how to help me through that fear or that panic. And I went in my room, jumped on the bed, bawled my eyes out. I didn't know I was actually helping my breathing by doing that, but it was ill-equipped. So I ask parents sometimes, what was the emotion that was not allowed in your house? Or think of 3 emotions that were not allowed in your house. And then why was that? And how do you wish your parents had dealt with you when you had those emotions? If you can get parents to think about that, then they can think, okay, what am I doing with my child when they have that emotion now? How does that make me feel uncomfortable? For me, when I was raising my kids, I didn't want them to feel sad. I didn't want them to feel afraid, and I didn't want them to feel angry. I'm grateful that by the time Sonia was around 8, I read the book called How to Talk to Your Kids So Your Kids Will Listen and How to Listen So Your Kids Will Talk. And in our Good Enough Parenting book, we got copyright permission to, if you go through our book, you'll see a bunch of cartoons. And some of the cartoons, we homemade cartoons about our nurturing interactions and our core needs. Some are directly related to what we got from the book, How to Talk to Your Kids So Your Kids Will Listen. I think some in the connection and acceptance and in the reasonable limits, especially. The idea of learning to name the emotion. So if you're listening to your child and you say, instead of saying, "Sweetie, Jesus doesn't want us to be angry," that's going to make kids either feel bad about themselves or be fed up and not want to talk to you anymore. Just listen for the emotion and say, without judgment, "Wow, sounds like you're feeling angry." That kind of opens the door for them to describe how they feel. In the future, it will help them to say, "I feel angry." For the time being, it's a way of showing acceptance to their feelings. One of the early, I would say, pioneers of great parenting, he's the one that trained John Gottman, for example, and he also trained the women that wrote the book I just mentioned. His name was Chaim Ginott, and he said, accept all feelings, but not necessarily all behaviors. There still can be consequences for the behavior, but that doesn't have to be discussed first. The first thing to do is to help them to feel connected and accepted by talking about the feeling. "Wow, it sounds like you're feeling angry." So imagine a child comes back from elementary school and says, "Oh, I wanted to punch that Michael in the nose." One way of responding is, "Sweetheart, Jesus doesn't want us to hit people," which is probably a fact, but it's going to make them feel either exasperated or feel like a failure. So instead, you could say, "Wow, it sounds like you're feeling angry," and just leave it at that. Then they'll say, "I sure was." They might say, "Yeah, I was angry because Michael was going around lifting up all the girls' school uniforms and pulling down their underwear." Then you would probably say, "Wow, if I was there, I would have been angry too." So how did you manage to not punch him in the nose? What did you do instead? You're having this great dialogue, and then you can come up with some solutions. Wow, so what do you think you might do tomorrow? Or would you like me to come to school and talk to your teacher about it? Or do you want to do that yourself? You're helping them with problem solving, and you're helping them see there was nothing wrong with that emotion, and you're being very accepting. Now, if they did punch Michael in the nose, then we can talk later about, did you know that if you do that at your school, they might actually kick you out of the school? Then you can talk about alternatives and consequences.
Thank you for that honesty, Karen. I love your example. Labeling our emotion. I know that in brain science, we use that as a strategy, right? Because when you label your emotion, it immediately brings it to your prefrontal cortex, where we are able to make right decisions and choose well. You work with faith and brain science. How do trauma-informed practice and faith-centered parenting actually strengthen each other? Because sometimes we could think that they are two different and they're in the opposite direction. But what would you say to parents who think that we have to choose either this or that? And this question is for you.
Thanks, Rita. I think when you think about trauma-informed parenting, just to summarize it, understanding our core needs. And sometimes when our core needs are not met as we were growing up, there might be different ways that we interpret events that happened in our lives that can be triggers. And that's where we need to make sure that we learn to really understand, why am I feeling this? Especially if we're hysterical, if we're having these strong emotion, there's usually a history behind it. And really doing the work of finding out what are your trauma triggers so that we're not passing it down. So I was thinking about what she was sharing. So Rita, can you rephrase that question? I want to make sure I answer it.
Basically, what I want to find out from you is how do we merge trauma-informed as well as faith-centered parenting, right? Sometimes we could swing either way. And
Sure.
I know that Karen mentioned earlier, we could say, Jesus wouldn't do that. Right. I have done that many times. But how do we merge that? Because I believe they work hand in hand, right?
I think the simple answer is studying out how Jesus was so trauma-informed. When the children were running around and being crazy, the disciples were like, send these kids away. They're not behaving well. And how did Jesus respond? He said, let the children come to me. He focused on connection because children regulate through relationship. So it's important to have that connection and also understanding that connection is not permissiveness. Sometimes parents might say, oh, we're just being too permissive. Actually, it's a pathway to influence. So that's where those boundaries, like the restrictions that Karen was talking about. But what's important is regulated parents help build regulated children. And so it's so important to understand the whole concept of repairing. When we're not regulated and we act out, we can talk to our kids and say, hey, mommy is really anxious right now. Mommy needs to breathe. We're modeling what to do when we're feeling that emotion. Or mommy got really angry and I am so sorry the way I responded. That tone was not okay. So we're modeling it because none of us are perfect. And I love how just walking with Jesus, not in the Pharisaic way of Jesus, making sure that we show the right impression of who God is to our children by modeling humility that Jesus showed, modeling self-regulation. So we can use the term trauma-informed, but basically it's understanding your own trauma so you're not hysterical and you're not acting out of your trauma, doing the work to figure out what are those core needs in me that were not met and how do I get that met through Jesus? Because it's so awesome that God sent his son so that we can actually have a parent that's perfect. And then we have a model who's perfect. When we live that faith-based way of having true faith in God and being humble, even if we messed up as parents, God always gives us an opportunity to repair. It doesn't matter if it was yesterday we messed up. Today we can sit and say, so sorry. This is how I want to do it differently.
Thank you, Pam. That is a bridge between what we're about to talk, connection, even in this conversation. Connection before correction, right? What does that actually look like in real life parenting situations? How would you help us with this connection before correction model?
Excellent. Okay. So I was thinking about how in the concept of church, a group, whenever you're doing any kind of leadership at church, one of the things we tell people is build your relationships, build your deep relationships during the good times so that during the bad times, you've already got that support. Don't think you're going to just be a Lone Ranger Christian and then one day when hard times come, suddenly you'll start building your relationships. It doesn't work that way. The fact that you have stayed faithful for many years means you've been living that. The same goes with parenting. So you don't say, all right, how can I do connection before correction in the moment? The connection has to be happening all the time. It has to be the foundation so that when it's time for correction, it's not going to be suddenly, oh no, I haven't spent time with my kids, or oh no, we're not close. So I don't know if that helps, but that's the short answer to that.
Yeah, I think I love that part when you said connections should happen all the time. Would you suggest any practices that we could maybe do that has probably helped you or for us as parents? What are some things appropriate that maybe we could do that will help us with that connection?
Okay, now, sorry, because this is going to sound a little bit like self-promotion. I'm sorry. But part of my husband's research in his PhD was to look in depth in Ephesians 6:4. Ephesians 6:4 and the parallel verse in Colossians 3:21 talks about not exasperating your kids, but instead nurturing. So the word in the NIV is bring them up in the training and discipline of the Lord. But that same word is translated in Ephesians 5 as nurture or nourish. So we like to say, and many versions of the Bible use the word nurture or nourish. So the way we say that passage is, do not exasperate your children, but nurture or nourish them in the training and discipline of the Lord. One of my friends that's been in the full-time ministry for years here in America, she said, that's interesting because I feel like we applied that verse wrong. The way we applied it was we exasperated them in the training and discipline of the Lord. So what we want to do is do not exasperate, but nurture in the training and discipline of the Lord. Therefore, I believe it's important for parents to learn the basics. You asked earlier about perfectionism and what does good enough mean. What Winnicott was saying was you don't have to be a perfect mom, but you do have to be good enough. And to me, you get good enough by getting some training, whether it's the coaching training that you guys are doing, learning to regulate your own emotions. That's very important. In our training, parents learn what are those 10 exasperation interactions that came out in the research all over the world. People in Africa, people in India, people in America, people in Asia. What were those 10 universal exasperation interactions that make kids feel exasperated? And at the same time, what are the 7 nurturing interactions that make kids walk away from an interaction with their parents feeling nurtured? They don't know they feel nurtured. Kids aren't cognizant of that. But when you do it repeatedly as a lifestyle, those core emotional needs get met.
Would you be able to share 1 or 2 practicals we could take in with us today in terms of what not to do and then what to do from your own life and things that worked for you? Because you have older kids now. What helped and what
Okay,
didn't?
so of course there are many that I could think of, but let's say if we have to isolate it to one, Deuteronomy 6, in that passage where Moses is talking about how parents should be with their kids, first he's talking about how parents should be with themselves. You should love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, or with all your strength. I know he says 3 of them, and Mark makes it 4. He says, and you should impress these things on your own heart. So first we have to impress it on our heart. Then we impress it on our children. And when we do, he says, talk about it when you lie down. Talk about it when you get up. Talk about it when you walk down the road. Talk about it when you're having breakfast. Talk about it when you're in the car on the way to school. Not that you want to be what someone once called scripture breath, where you're constantly quoting scriptures at your kids, but talking about God and emotions and life and being an approachable person and being a person who's open emotionally should be a lifestyle. And you're just always thinking quietly in your own head and not talking to your kids, they're not going to know what you're feeling. And so just having conversations, just notice if you see something, we don't read newspapers that much anymore, but when my kids were little, we still had a newspaper. So talking about something from the front page, oh, that's so interesting. And figuring out a way to talk about that in a spiritual context. When the kids have had something happen at school and they tell you their highs and lows at dinner time, celebrate with them, turning it back into some kind of spiritual conversation, not in an annoying way or in any way that sounds judgmental, but just so that they know God is always there. So, yeah, talk more and don't exasperate when you talk.
I love the practical that you gave us about talk about the highs and lows. Right? I remember doing that when my kids were younger, but somehow I forgot about it. And I think it's relevant for all kids, even for adult kids, asking, what was your high today? Or what was your low today? And I think that helps in the connection, as you mentioned, Karen. So I love that. Thank you for that. I know that on the same lines, we have the new parenting styles where it's all permissible and it's, what's that, sensitive, gentle parenting? The scripture tells us, of course, do not provoke your children to anger. But what does grace-filled parenting look like in everyday family life? How would you describe it?
So part of, I believe, is we have to have grace on ourselves. So if we are always beating ourselves up for every mistake we make as a Christian, we might turn around and do the same thing to our children. Or we might be filled with shame. If people grew up feeling shamed by their parents or shamed by their society, then when they have children, they tend to put shame on their kids. It's one of those dysfunctions that passes down. So as Pam said earlier, getting healthy yourself, learning to not feel shame about everything, that can take several years of therapy. I'm not saying this is some easy light bulb decision you make, but I think just telling yourself, I'm not going to let my kids, I'm not going to feel shamed by my kids' behavior. I'm not going to let myself be defined. Like when my kids are quote unquote naughty when we're out in public or disrespectful to someone at church or whatever, I'm not going to immediately be filled with shame and think, oh my gosh, how do I look as a parent? It's not about you. And the core emotional needs still apply. And your kids still need to feel connection and acceptance. And you still need to make sure when you're parenting, you're not exasperating, but you're nurturing. So having those really strong core values in yourself. Of course, the reason it's called good enough is because no one is perfect in that. I really did try, but there were times when I really blew it. One time, a funny story. So it was Sonia. Sonia was 11 and her emotions were coming out in puberty as they do in girls of that age. It was a Saturday morning and we had talked about how she was going to spend the night with one of the other girls from our church. I was close to the parents and I was fine with her doing that. So one Saturday morning about 10 a.m., Sonia said to me, hey, Mom, I'm not going to spend the night with so-and-so. Instead, I'm going to spend the night with this other girl. And the other girl was a friend from school who happened to live in the same apartment building we lived in. Again, I knew the parents. But because that person was not from a home that had a faith-based mindset, I freaked out. Oh, no, my daughter prefers to hang out with people that don't love God. It was like I went there in my head. I was freaking out. Oh my gosh, my kid's not going to want to be a Christian. She likes to hang out with people that don't have faith. So it's those weird fears you have that you start prophesying 30 years down the road or 20 years down the road. And that causes what I call the parenting freak out. And then as I was freaking out inside, I thought, oh, at least make sure she has a quiet time. So here she's only 11. She just got out of bed at 10 in the morning on a Saturday. She had slept in because she had a long night the night before. And I said, okay, but tell me what you did for your quiet time this morning. And she was like, I haven't had my quiet time. I just got to. This is a total confession. I literally had the biggest parenting freak out. And I just looked at her and I was like, fine, go to hell then. Don't become a Christian. See if I care. Can you imagine? I actually said that out loud to my child. And she looked at me and she said, who are you? So the good thing is I didn't do that very much normally. So she knew that was very weird. And she's, are you from a different planet? Who are you? And when she said that to me, I said, Mommy needs a timeout and I'm going out for a prayer walk. So I gave myself a timeout and went outside and had a prayer walk. And I'm like, what is going on in my head? And I was able to realize, oh, wow, I'm prophesying 20 years down the road just because of one incident. And so it's those fears that you get petrified and you explode in this parenting freak out. So fortunately, that was not my lifestyle.
Thank you, Sharon. That is definitely a funny story. Our kids are very forgiving. I guess that's how children are. They do forgive you. I want to highlight the part where you talked about shame and now fear. So many of us, our everyday life runs on this shame and fear running in the background. It's like the software that's running at the back in the computer or those apps that are open. And I think that influences so much of what we do. And the things we say about the future, the predictions that we do, all these big fears. I do want to focus on the last segment of our talk. I believe that many of us as parents, we fear making mistakes that will damage our children. And we think, oh no, I did this. What's going to happen? How important is the concept of repair in parenting? And how can parents do this well?
I think that's a great question about repair. And I appreciate your vulnerability, Karen, and sharing that story because it illustrates how we can have the fear or the shame running in the background and our words, like our behavior, we're not communicating the fear and the shame. We're communicating out of our anger or our emotions. I think as parents, we have this fear and pressure. What if I damage my child? What if I say the wrong thing? What if I repeat unhealthy patterns from my own upbringing? But the thing about our brain, it's neuroplastic. It can repair, it can heal, it can change. So I love the whole concept of good enough parenting because children don't need perfect parents. They need parents who can reconnect after a rupture. And in every relationship, there's going to be moments of disconnection when we lose patience or we react too quickly or we misunderstand. I think the goal is not perfection. It's that repair. It's one of the greatest gifts we can model for our children because it teaches them that relationships can heal. Mistakes are survival. Saying it was just too harsh earlier, or this was my fear. This is what Mom is afraid of, and I'm working on it. Or this is how I experienced my childhood, so my tone can be stronger. One thing I appreciate about both my children is they always call me out. They're like, Mom, when they do call us out, not being defensive, but apologizing, because emotions can be repaired. Even though we may have insecurity growing up, there's different insecure attachment styles. We can grow to be secure because repair represents the heart of God so beautifully. The whole story of God is we are being ministers of reconciliation. So repair is like this gift. So we don't have to walk around with shame and guilt and fear. We can transition our brain to create what they call in research is love bonds rather than fear bonds. And so recognizing the biggest thing is self-awareness, being able to know, okay, I am acting out of fear right now, which is that illustration that Karen just shared with us. She was acting out of her fear and being able to go for that prayer walk and be able to talk to God about it and be able to realize it and just come back and say, hey, this is what happened. so that the child doesn't make up stories in his mind that something's wrong with me because mom's angry with me. So repair is a gift that we need to embrace.
Karen, would you like to
All I would add to that is it takes embarrassing humility as a parent to do that. So we have to tell ourselves in Matthew 18, Jesus says, unless you humble yourself and become like a little child, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. So what is that telling us? We all need to have that kind of embarrassing humility. We shouldn't listen to what society says. Romans 12:2 in the New Living Translation says, don't give in to the culture and the behavior of the world. The world around us says parents should be in control or parents shouldn't apologize. But we should do the opposite. That doesn't mean we're groveling in front of our kids. It just means we are quick to repair, like what Pam said. If you ever enjoyed the 5 love languages, the same author, Gary Chapman, about 10 years later, did research on the 5 languages of apology. He talks about how people feel that an apology was sincere slightly differently. So what makes people feel the apology was sincere? I don't have time to tell you all of those 5 points, but it's wonderful. I teach it a lot in Good Enough Parenting, especially parents of adult children. So you can Google it and find it just like that.
Love it. Yeah. That point about embarrassing humility. Oh, dear Lord. But I think that is the hardest. And I think for so many parents here, I'm sure that can resonate. For some of us, I guess it's easier, maybe because we grew up watching a parents model it. But for some of us, we grew up with parents who never said an apology in their life. And so now to be able to do that is so hard. It's almost like you're losing a piece of yourself. But really, it's not. This time we've had together, the hope that we can repair things, no matter where it is at, whether it's with your adult children or teens or even young kids who have a lot more time. But some of us have adult kids and we feel like we've lost our time. This repair can happen, and that gives us hope. Thank you both for it. I do want to mention again that we do run a small group coaching series called Brain Reset, designed for parents who want to practice what we have heard today in learning how we can model, how we can change so that we can be better parents and we can show up differently. If you are curious about it, no pressure. I just want to put it out there. If you are someone who wants to know about it, I want to ask you for one last word each from each of you. What is the one thing you most want every parent in this room to walk away with today? Just one thing. What would you say?
I have to say 2 words: emotional climate. So if parents can be aware of the emotional climate in their home, because that emotional climate is what's going to determine if your kids are getting more nurturance or more exasperation. So that's what I would say.
And I think just to add to that, your child doesn't need a perfect parent. Your child needs a connected parent. So connect with your relationship with God, connect with yourself, connect before you correct, and also just repair over perfection. We can't be perfect, but we can apologize. We can be embarrassingly humble. Just making sure that we're focusing on being present over just performing. Over the years, we are trained to keep performing. And this season of my life, I am training myself to be present and enjoy the moment. And I have a great son who's teaching me that because he's so good at that.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you, Pam, truly. And to every parent who's here today, thank you for showing up. I know that it's a Saturday. Your morning is precious. Some of you may be joined in while you're doing your laundry. That's okay. I see you. Remember, you're not failing. You are showing up. And that is important, right? We don't need to be perfect parents. We just need to be present, like Pam mentioned. And we need to understand the emotional climate, as Karen mentioned. If we can get the hang of these 2 things, we're well on our journey for repairing things. You're not alone. There's a whole community out there of parents in this room, beyond this room, walking on the same road. So be gentle with yourself. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. If this conversation moved you, share it with a parent who needs to hear it. And remember, you don't have to be perfect. You just have to show up. Until next time, go gently, stay connected, and never forget, Repair is always possible.